Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm Gediminas Urbonas, Director of MIT Program in Art, Culture, and Technology. And I'd like to welcome you all to the third installment of the Monday night lecture series, Curation, Agencies, and Urgencies. ACT is perennially concerned with the questions of artistic research and how artworks and practices are made public today. And this term, we are welcoming curators, cultural producers, and educators operating across institutional boundaries and scales to help us to see how curation shapes our conception of art and of social change, and how it helps us to perceive that change. Tonight, we are welcoming writer, curator, educator, and researcher, Anne-Sophie Springer. I will say a few words that after experiencing the talk by Caroline Christoph Bakardjiev, who is working on these larger scale mega projects that perhaps also Timothy Martin would call hyper objects, like Documenta. We are here today, we are witnessing a different scale as Anne-Sophie Springer proposes book scale as exhibition, right? So we are dealing with proximities between the scales. The book as a site for exhibition making, right? So the book becomes a platform and I think a vehicle and a site for exploration of how research could find its way to be unfolded, right? So the site where the research is being produced and also experimented with the way how it is staged as well. And today we have a respondent, Jessica Kazrick, first-year graduate student at ACT. And perhaps without long ado, I would like to give floor to our speaker, Anne-Sophie Springer. And please help me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Gediminas. I'm really excited to be here. It's a very unexpected short notice invitation, and I must say I've had a kind of a terrible weekend, and so I'm really excited to have this kind of hopefully change my own being in the world right now. So I'm going to talk tonight about two recent curatorial and editorial projects that I realized in collaboration with my partner and co-conspirator Etienne Turpin over the last year, and these projects are still ongoing. And I have, as you can see, I've slightly sneakily changed the title, appropriating your lecture series title somewhat, because I would like to focus, as your series is about the curatorial, I would like to really focus on the practice elements of the work and see where we can take that in the discussion after, rather than produce a lecture about a theoretical lecture about the Anthropocene. And so I've divided the presentation into part one, curatorial agency publishing in the Anthropocene. So still conceive of the work in the horizon line of the Anthropocene discourse, and I'll go back in and out of it, but just not like a proper long theoretical positioning of that. And the second part is curatorial urgency exhibiting in the Anthropocene. And so the first part is about a book series, the Book as Exhibition series that Gediminas already mentioned, and the second part brings in the question of natural history archives in the context of the Anthropocene, so historical collections of biodiversity, primarily Indonesian geographical area, and how we can work with that curatorially in the context of contemporary urgencies and questions. But just briefly, so the Earth, just an inscription of the horizon line of the Anthropocene. So the Earth's evolutionary history has been divided into a series of geological epochs, and officially we are still living in the so-called Holocene. I'm sure you know all of this, but to make sure. In the Holocene, an epoch which was determined to have started at the end of the last ice age nearly 12 millennia ago. Geological epochs are distinguished according to major recognizable shifts in the Earth's geological core, its sediment structure, and fossil record. It was the Dutch chemist Paul Crutzen who suggested in a paper published in Nature in the year 2002 that our current age should be given a new definition, distinct from the Holocene. And that is because of the dramatic human impact on the planet's interior organization, which was set loose, as Crutzen proposes, but which is, of course, contested, set loose since and through the accelerated processes of industrialization, so in the mid-18th century. This is an impact which has been linked to irreversible planetary transformations such as global climate change, ocean acidification, a steep rise in CO2 emissions, worldwide urbanization and telecommunication networks, high increases in species extinction due to habitat destruction, and many other complex issues that we are still often struggling to fully understand and visualize. And I think in the kind of the larger context of art and curatorial or cultural practices, this is the question of how can we use our practices and our work to grapple with this incommensurable scale that we're faced with. So crucial to the thesis is the recognition that anthropogenic impacts are being inscribed into the geological structure of the Earth, thus rewriting the planet's composition in ways that will be readable in the deep future, tens of thousands of years from now, long after the human species itself might have gone extinct. So in their important paper on the fundamental role of European colonialism regarding the genesis of the Anthropocene, the London-based scientists Mark Maslin and Simon Lewis recently stated, the recognition of human actions as far-reaching drivers of change in the systems that support life on this planet produces implications for our philosophical, social, economic, and political views of the environment. But to borrow a phrase from Robert Smithson's essay, A Sedimentation of the Mind, how then to deal with this heap of wrecked maps that we are faced with? And the question that I want to take up from here in the context of anthropogenic impact inscribed into the Earth's core is a question of reading and writing, and how are we made to read and write, and how can we reassemble those mechanisms. So how to read now and how to organize narratives is that question that I think resonates deeply with curatorial practice, or a curatorial practice that flows into artistic methodologies, perhaps into historical, into research of historical kind, composition, collaboration, and deep affinities to the archive. And so the first part now in this context is a commission of a book series. So I run in Berlin, since 5 years, I've been running a small arts and theory press called K Verlag, where we have been looking at the book as an exhibition space already before the series was inaugurated last year. And so that comes out of, if you will, a conceptual legacy of artist books that conceive of the book space as an architectural space that doesn't necessarily need the art gallery any longer, or for its instantiation, but it also questions the role of the exhibition catalog as a mechanism of documenting exhibitions. And in the previous projects that we've done, we've used the publication space as its own room, or its own space for articulating sometimes the research that flows into that underpins an art installation or so on. And so in 2014, Etienne and I participated in a workshop at a large cultural institution in Berlin, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, in a curatorial network, Synapse International Curators Network, and both presented about, in parts, presented about previous work that we had done independently on book and exhibition correlations. And so then we were invited to come up with a proposal for a series that would kind of build try to establish a vocabulary for the Anthropocene, dealing with natures and cultures, subject-object relations, because the Haus der Kulturen did a 2-year program cycle about the Anthropocene, with performance, with lectures, art exhibitions. Maybe you've been there. And so as a member of the Synapse International Curators Network at the Haus der Kulturen, I now co-edit the Intercalations Paginated Exhibition series. And this project is conceived as a curatorial editorial space to both host and critically reflect on contemporary exhibition making practices and their mode of knowledge co-production, while also enabling explorations of the book as a form of exhibition architecture in relation to other aesthetic practices in the Anthropocene. Conceived as a 6-part publication series, the project takes its title from a term that is used both in the realm of geology as well as in literature. In geology, the term intercalation signifies that one type of rock was pushed or is being pushed in between other stratified segments. With reference to its Latin etymology, the word means being inserted between an existing proclamation, or something that has been understood as official and of great importance is changed because of a new layer or element having entered the reified sequence. In contrast to hard rock, the stuff of narrative is softer and more malleable to begin with. Nevertheless, in a novel, the work of weaving one story into another shares the eponymous, albeit literary term intercalation. In the wake of the Anthropocene thesis, which at least in part contends that anthropogenic sedimentations are transforming previous geological compositions in literally fundamental ways, the intercalating of existing stories and official proclamations with transformative and erratic new layers seems of particular urgency. And so we published these first 2 volumes that you see here last year, and we are currently working on 4 more. 2 of them are almost ready for publication. They're a bit late. They were supposed to be out in the fall, but coming now in the spring. And so for you guys, I'm going to focus on the first book, Fantasies of the Library, because that contains a substantial part of my own research. It comes out of previous research that I have done before the series was conceived, exactly in relation to the book as an exhibition space, and then questions of, well, if the book itself is conceived as a space to experience as more than the page as a neutral surface, with relays of time and motion, then how curatorially would you exhibit something like that so that it would make sense? Because you often, in typical book exhibition settings, you have a vitrine where then you cannot interface as a reader, you cannot access the publications anymore. So I did a larger scale research about this, and the work went into Fantasies of the Library, and land and animal and non-animal. For me, in my position, I'm more an editor rather than also an authorial figure, or if you will. So in 1931, the Indian mathematician and librarian Shyali Ramanrita Raghunathan published 5 laws of library science as a concise guide for librarians. 1, books are for use. 2, every reader her book. 3, every book its reader. 4, save the time of the reader. 5, the library is a growing organism. I like these heuristics because they make it clear that the library is a fundamentally relational space, with connections and affinities distributed among the librarians and the library users, the books themselves, the interior space of the collection, and the world outside its walls. While libraries have traditionally been considered systems to aggregate and access knowledge, they are no less infrastructures of thought in need of special care. In Intercalations and Fantasies of the Library especially, we explore the library as a system and an infrastructure, but also as a curatorial space enabling custodianship, solidarity, exploration, and the promiscuity of affective and conceptual constellations. Especially influenced by ideas of praxis and change, so Raghunathan's first and fifth laws, Fantasies is a book about the ways we organize and archive culture and scholarship, and how these assemblages shape, in turn, the ways we think, read, and write. Change has become so ubiquitous that in our present situation, we can easily fail to think about the speed and consequence of even epochal shifts. When the concept of the Anthropocene can be rendered as just another theme for the perpetuation of biennales and conferences, it is hard to grasp the value of overcoming binaries. What's really at stake when transgressing these alleged divides between nature and culture, human and non-human, if their politics and histories aren't but taken seriously? So we became more interested in the problems of organizations and discipline. Must order and creativity be considered oppositional practices? Isn't the overvalued estimation of creativity, especially in the register of the curatorial, often just a permissive password that allows for loose associations and the absence of rigorous engagement under the neoliberal big tent? Fantasies are not, as is so often imagined, the product of spontaneous invention. They require care, cultivation, and discipline to truly disrupt their systems of containment. So while producing these fantasies, we encountered the artistic work of Andrew Norman Wilson. His series Scanops from 2012 to 14, which conjures a specter of cultural appropriation, is intercalated throughout the volume. Scanops is the internal referent for Google's book scanning facilities in California. Wilson's series collects the errata which occur during the digitization process that produces Google Books. The images of book pages defaced by accidental stains, smears, and dirty rubber gloves are a profound reminder of the physical labor that generates the allegedly universal cognitive access to content owned and further monetized by Google. But the erratic magenta fingers also implicate the proprietary software used by Google to quickly detect these conspicuous pink digits and thereby delete any trace of the labor and laborers producing their digital investments. They reveal the processes required to format knowledge. As such, they also issue an uncanny reminder about the formidable difficulty of fully erasing its history of production. This fantasy library shares concerns in aggregated labors, a construction site full of temptations, shifting alliances, and the reproduction of reproductions. Perhaps this is because we are old enough to remember going to the library. When we wanted to do research or to learn, we went to the library. If the physical journey to a physical space has been replaced for so many readers by searching, I search, therefore I scroll, as my friend Geraldine Juarez says, the curatorial work of the librarian has also been largely replaced by proprietary search algorithms that monetize every single query, amassing a fortune with which to acquire ever more content. In this way, it's not just the librarian who's been digitized and privatized, but the public relationship with the collection as well. As Wilson noted in his 2013 interview with Laurel Ptak, quote, "The workers compose part of the photographic apparatus, which in a broad sense includes not only the machinery but the social systems in which photography operates. The anonymous workers, Google founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the pink finger condoms, infrared cameras, the autocorrection software, the capital required to fund the project, the ink on my rag the ink on my rag, paper prints, me, we're all part of it. By preparing this presentation, Google's parent company, Alphabet, became the most valuable company in the world, with an estimated worth of 520 billion US dollars. Within this vast accumulation, we do not know the precise value of Google Books. Nevertheless, we are all part of it. Juarez, while describing Google's colonial aspiration, remarks, organizing information is never innocent. Colonization without the archive is a purely military affair. Without promoting culture online, Google would appear as it really is, an engine searching for ever new ways to maximize its profits. And certainly, we cannot leave what a library should do to the world's wealthiest corporation. I'll say a few things about the structure of the book now, and then I continue reading a section, and then the other part about the exhibition is not read, is spoken freely. But so with the book, with the first book in the series, Fantasies of the Library, what we are trying to do in relation to the 5 following books is to draw the attention of our readers, or as we call them, reader as exhibition viewers, to the mechanisms that scholarship and aggregation work, and to the book as a mechanism that, as a human, particularly human technology, that we do not perceive as, kind of as a background that we do not perceive. And so the design component to the book is very important in the sense that this is a curatorial decision as well as design and curatorial in the way in which we have intercalated the different contributions in the book. It's something that I explained to you here in the room, but it's nowhere explained when you open the book, because there's a mechanism where you stumble into this publication, and the habitual reading our reading habits of following in a Western sense from left to right page, reading verso recto, is completely interrupted by the way that the different pieces, interviews, a visual essay, and a long curatorial theoretical essay are positioned towards each other, which then creates an experience that we kind of relate to an experience of going see an exhibition, where there's a variety of objects always together in a room, and you have to make a decision where you focus your attention to, as well as the correlations and relationships of one object to another is always different. So you enter the space several times, and you can unless it's an exhibition that has a decisive trajectory, but you could visit the space, you can visit the book many times and decide how you're gonna read and how you're gonna see. And so that format of destruction and assemblage is something that we are creating very consciously in the publication. And so the previous images and the following images on the screen take you through various reading rooms and reading machines by scholars and artists that are published in the book. And always these are spaces that privilege contingent and serendipitous relations in the sense of A.B. Warburg's law of the good neighbor, rather than standardized organization principles of official library systems. So it plays with subjectivized forms of grouping material, grouping ideas, the changing nature of research. So among the exemplary fantasies of the library, an especially consequential series of events unfolded in London in the early 1960s. 2 book lovers, the playwright Joe Orton and his boyfriend Kenneth Halliwell, were each sentenced to 6 months in prison for institutional violation. The charge followed from their repeated theft of library books, which they altered by replacing their cover illustrations with humorously surreal, often sexually explicit collages, as well as by pasting their own comical text passages over the book's blurbs. Once reformatted, the couple would secretly return the modified text to the library shelves, where they would re-enter the normal boring processes. Recently presented, so in 2014, presented at Artist Space in New York City, maybe you've seen that show as well, as the Defaced Library, books of Kenneth Halliwell and Joe Orton. The installation consisted of a wallpaper created from blown up black and white police photos of the couple's bed-sit-cum collage studio, as you can see here. Itself densely covered from floor to ceiling with portrait reproductions torn from innumerous art books. A paginated living space swarming with a multitude of characters. As the appropriated library and its unsolicited curators encountered the force of the law, Orton and Halliwell's experience of the state apparatus must have been a nightmare, not least because homosexuality was still ostracized and legally prosecuted in most Western countries. The library, a space of potential social emancipation, failed to provide a transformative sanctuary for the two men. In a passage from 1960, Orton pondered the revolutionary potential of the book, writing that it would vibrate the structure, but not enough. The couple spent nearly 3 years constructing and dispatching their interventions, but the violence of the state proved inexorable. Not 10 years after their imprisonment, Halliwell, who suffered from severe depression, tragically killed his partner Orton before committing suicide himself. Half a century later, the books they modified are considered valuable artifacts, with a special place in the collection of the Islington Local History Centre in London. The commemoration of these interventionist works within such a collection evokes a strange affect. Indeed, the institutional absorption of a revolutionary gesture is no matter of celebration for those still committed to vibrating the structure by repurposing its function. This account of so-called institutional violations evokes the tragedy of two other men who also lived together and shared a tenacious affection for the library. François Denis Bartholomé Buvard and Juste Romain Coeur de Pécuchet. As the main characters of Flaubert's last book, Buvard and Pécuchet, published posthumously in 1881, the two copy clerks are consumed by their desire for scientific knowledge. As clerks, however, the pair have no particular training in evaluating anything beyond reproduction. Yet, once they are freed from the constraints of tiresome labor and have retired to the countryside, they are seized by the characteristically modern lust to explore and absorb all knowledge. Relying on their professional background of directly copying texts, Buvard and Pécuchet thus acquire and consult an encyclopedic range of scientific books covering agriculture and animal husbandry, medicine and anatomy, chemistry, astronomy, geology, history, archaeology, and many other disciplines, which operate as analogic models for their own naive actions within the narrative. Perversely immune to perceiving the creative relationship between experience and knowledge, every new project Buvard and Pécuchet undertake goes farcically wrong. Every experiment is botched, every dish spoiled, every design a disgrace. And every time they set out to present their newest achievement to a public of neighbors and distant friends, they inspire only aversion, shock, disbelief, and scorn. Yet, they are stubbornly modern, that is, unable to learn from previous mistakes, hurrying instead to take up ever more grotesque tasks to heap onto their ever-growing pile of failed emendations. They are a twin emblem of the unintended consequences of dispassionate interest, oscillating as they do between tragedy and farce in an arms race of epistemic reductionism. A menacing caricature of the modern scientific mentality, Flaubert's novel is no less a manifesto for the forms of life in perpetual excess of empirical observation, the accumulation of texts, or the sequencing of information. With each new failure of Buvard and Pécuchet, we are reminded that the library's power is not as a container of knowledge, but lies instead, in the words of Alberto Manguel, in the experience rescued from the page and transformed again into experience. Thought demands careful observation and rigorous discipline, but these alone do not provide the requisite potency for creative construction. It is only when observation and discipline are invigorated by the promiscuous adjacencies and kaleidoscopic entanglements of inexact relations that the imagination is produced. This process is by definition interminable, and as Flaubert knew well, inaptitude consists in wanting to conclude. To admit authorities, Virginia Woolf writes, however heavily furred and gowned, into our libraries and let them tell us how to read, what value to place upon what we read, is to destroy the spirit of freedom, which is the breath of those sanctuaries. Everywhere else we may be bound by laws and conventions, but there we have none. So taken together, the cases of Orton and Halliwell and Bouvard and Pécuchet remind us that the curator of the library is tasked with relaying this spirit of freedom, described by Woolf. Fantasies in this constellation are neither a product of fancy nor of spontaneity, but result from the passionate and careful treatment of the library as a curatorial space. Because of this, and despite Foucault's remark to the contrary, we think that you should never leave it to the police or the bureaucrats to see that the library is in order. And then with this image, I'm going to move on to the natural history exhibition that we realized last year in Indonesia. So this was the agency part, so now your minds are scaled towards the urgency part, I hope. 125,660 specimens of natural history was a exhibition experiment that we did, that we finally premiered in August last year in an art gallery in Jakarta in Indonesia called Komunitas Salihara, which is the most progressive multi-art space in the country, one could say. Indonesia, I don't know how much you know, but it's a very huge island archipelago, 17,000 islands, 240 million inhabitants across the islands, and Komunitas Salihara is in the capital, Jakarta. For instance, is a very political space, comes out of the student resistance movements against the dictatorship in the 90s, and is, for instance, the space that showed Joshua Oppenheimer's The Act of Killing for the first and the only time for a very long time in the country. And so we were interested, so I had done an exhibition before in 2012 in Leipzig, in the Ethnographic Museum of Leipzig, looking at anthropometric photography from the 1920s, a very racist photography archive, and trying to work from a post-colonial point of view with this very problematic material in the context of an exhibition that I co-curated there. And so in the conversation about Anthropocene Matters, we then questioned the role of the natural history collection in its colonial legacy, which is something which in an ethnographic context, of course in institutional critique, has been unpacked for several decades, but in the natural history collection or archival context, that's not necessarily very present. So if you go to exhibitions in natural history museums, what they show us is nature is kind of still intact, is functions in the wild, is apart from the human world, and there's never really a question of where these objects come from, the context in which they were produced as taxidermy, the colonial relationships between the Western host countries where natural history museums were started in the late 18th century, early 19th century. And so we were interested in that in a broader sense. And then Etienne, who is based in Jakarta, had moved to Jakarta at the time, found a book by this naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who spent 8 years navigating, exploring the Malay archipelago between 1854 and 1862, and he was the one that collected these 125,660 specimens, which he then sold and shipped to collections in Europe, primarily in the UK. And he left to us a chronic of his travels, and he was in many cases the first white European who accessed certain islands. He was the first who brought living birds of paradise to Kew Gardens, upon which then these birds became highly popular in the fashion and garment industry, bird hats and bird scarves and so on. And so by the end of the 19th century, you can trace that arc, many bird of paradise species became critically endangered up until the early 20th century, and then an environmental movement about the birds of paradise ensued, and kind of the bird of paradise becomes the emblem of the Indonesian environmental movement and independence movement in that. So there's a really interesting connection here. And so then we were interested in using Alfred Russel Wallace as a kind of a narrative protagonist to look at the transformation and Anthropocenic or land use transformation of the archipelago from the 19th century. So looking at records of Wallace, but also other naturalists who were active in the area at the time, and compare that to land use transformation. Deforestation is a huge issue. So compare that, and the aim was to collaborate with local artists as well as with local and international scientists. And I skipped this, but so we had an open call a year before the exhibition then came together, and we worked with 13 Indonesian participants that then were commissioned to make new work in conversation with us, as well as with the zoological curators of the Indonesian Institute of Science, who in the meantime had become partners for the project. And then we worked with a number of international artists as well as scientists. So Ed Scholes and Tim Lehman, for example, they are ornithologists and wildlife photographers. So it's not strictly art, and you'll see that in the exhibition documentation in a second too. But so here's Indonesia, and this is the map of Wallace's journey. The black lines are his travels. And just as a reference, so if a 19th century collector collected a lot, then that would be easily 20,000 or 30,000 specimens, and Wallace has 125,000 and more. So this is a tremendous number of specimens. And so initially we wanted to make a project about that collection itself, as well as an archive, as a conglomeration of objects that we imagined existed as such. But then little did we know that in the natural history context, so in the ethnographic context, it's very common that you have a collection that is contained as per the collector. But in the biological setting, the objects are then, they arrive in the museums, and then they are distributed according to taxonomical classification orders. So the collector himself is not very relevant to the biological side of the science. In history of science, yes, but so efforts to find these objects are kind of partly more recent. And why Wallace is in a context of history of science also noteworthy, important, is because during his time in the archipelago, he understood, based on his really huge amount of comparative biological productions, he was capable of deducing the theory of evolution by natural selection, which he then formulated in a letter that he sent to London, which then was given to Darwin. Wallace very young, Darwin a studied scientist, Wallace not at all, somebody who goes to collect and to make money and to survive. Nevertheless, very smart, and so he's able to produce this understanding, sends it to London, and then Wallace is, I'm making this very short, but then Darwin is pushed by colleagues Lyell and Huxley to publish The Origin of Species, to publish his notes, which he hasn't been up until this point published for 30 years because he wasn't quite ready yet to produce that kind of break. And so for us, in this context of Anthropocenic legacies and Western conceptions that are kind of shaping, if you will, shaping the planet and the context within which we are finding ourselves, the origin, if you will, of the theory of evolution, one of these huge modern conceptions of the world and organizational cognitive infrastructures of the world, kind of has an origin in this geographical zone, which we aren't necessarily aware of, and so we thought we'll make a project about this. So here you can see Wallace's notebooks, very meticulously charted, all the specimens he found, all the animals he found, the day, the location, and so on. These notebooks are today in the Linnaean Society in London, and we exhibited facsimiles of these partly. And what you should also know is that out of these 125,660 specimens, only 2 objects, one bird is in the Singapore Natural History Museum, and then 2 years ago, one beetle was returned by the Oxford Natural History Museum to the Borneo Natural History Museum, but all of the other objects are in European collections. And it was not possible for us to bring those back, and this is why the partnership with the Indonesian Institute was very remarkable, because that allowed us to loan specimens equivalent to the species that Wallace collected and exhibit them in the exhibition alongside the artwork and alongside the other projects. The work was also based on several trips of field work to different zones of transformation. And here you see palm oil, a fruit of palm oil. And so Borneo and Sumatra Borneo is the 3rd largest island in the world, and there are zones of deforestation and land use clearing for palm oil plantations to an extent of 40 to 60% of clear-cut forests, which then means that the biodiversity that Wallace collected in the 19th century is radically under threat and destruction. Where palm oil is in basically every product, from cosmetics to food to biofuels, and has experienced an increase of usage by 65% since 1995, where Indonesia and Malaysia produce 80 to 90% of crude palm oil, and therefore huge zones of landscape are being transformed into production sites for palm oil plantations, which you can see here. This is a crude oil factory on Sumatra, and the line of the trucks is 4 times as long as you can see here. And we talked to the drivers, and they wait there for 3 days until they reach the gate, which was a scene that reminded. I'm from West Berlin, and when I saw this, I had a childhood memory of the transit zone where you were parked in order to cross the border and get into East Germany and then out again. But this was the only time that I had consciously kind of encountered a line of cars with no engine on because nothing is moving. And here you can see a deforestation site in southern Borneo. So Borneo is divided between Malaysia and Indonesia, and southern Kalimantan is the name for the Indonesian part. So then Jakarta itself is a huge megacity with, in the inner city 10,000 inhabitants, and around that up to 28 million, which means that because the islands are transformed so radically, people lose their livelihoods and move to the city. But that doesn't mean that younger people even if their parents are from the islands and have lived as subsistence farmers, for instance, doesn't mean that the younger generation has a very direct relationship to that nature out there. So we partnered with the Zoological Museum outside of Jakarta, and 15 of the artists were invited to do this workshop with the scientists, where each could, based on their proposals from the beginning, each then maybe one was working with tigers and one was working towards insects, and so then we paired the artists with respective scientists, and they established a conversation upon which they then developed the works. Here's just some documentation photography from that workshop. And then the architecture, as you'll see, now we are moving to the exhibition, but this is the lab architecture in the Institute of Science, and we appropriated this kind of architecture and displaced that into the gallery space at Salihara. So we made similar tables in a modular structure, 29 tables, which we arranged as a kind of an archipelagic situation. And then the showcases from the museum could be inserted into some of those tables kind of as ready-mades quite directly. So this is the layout of the gallery, and we had altogether more than 250 objects that were displayed. So then here you can see the table structure, and then so an oval gallery space, and as I said, we couldn't show the original Wallace specimens, but we worked with Fred Langford Edwards, who's a British photographer who has been actually going to the collections in the UK for many years, trying to find the original Wallace specimens, and he makes these beautiful large scale middle format prints, photographs of these specimens, and so we presented a series of his photography kind of as a horizon line around the gallery space. And then so the scientific specimens and the artworks were exhibited in this way on these tables in these vitrines, in very close proximity, and we didn't specify. I mean, you're a professional art crowd, so you will be able to make that distinction probably very easily. But the show was geared towards the art and the science community, and so it wasn't the literacy or so were quite fluid, and that's something that we really wanted there. So we wanted that conversation between the different fields of production, of knowledge production, as well as of material production. And yeah, kids. This is the taxonomy of palm oil installation, which we just brought to Princeton last week. So this is 100 containers of samples of products that contain this palm oil substance. Here with products from the Indonesian market, but in the Princeton case, we made it new, so it's products that are from the American market. Sorry. So then here's just an arrangement of birds that are equivalent to the birds that Wallace discovered and classified. So in the natural history context, you either collect and find, or you collect and find unknown to objects that are species that are unknown to science, and so these are the birds that hadn't been known to Western scientists at the point in time. This is a scientific specimen of an orangutan, which means it's not a taxidermy. In the zoological context of museology, you have the stuffed taxidermy that you know from the exhibitions, and then you have the scientific. So here's the skin. That means that the bones are taken out and they're contained in the drawer next to the skin. So in this case, it was a very flat and very sad looking orangutan. So, and then here's just 3 examples of artwork that were in the exhibition, curated into the exhibition from international artists that had made the work apart, not in direct conversation with the project, but it already existed. So Mark Dion's Anthropocene Monument, small drawing of this pillar. Then here, Shannon Castleman's photo series of the tree wounds, and which is a project that comes out of field work that she did in southern Sulawesi, where because of deforestation, the local population isn't allowed to log anymore, even for their own needs. And so they established a practice of, is very interesting, of incremental logging, where each time a villager goes past a tree, hacks the tree once perhaps with a machete and continues walking, and then another person does it, and another person, so that over time the tree is felled, and then nobody is, it dies or it falls, and nobody is specifically responsible. And so she took a series of these tree wound photographs. And then here's another close-up photo of Fred Langford Edwards' specimen photography. Oh yeah, and then, so as I said, we didn't specify in the arrangement of the exhibition that the artwork scientific object correlation, but then there was a publication, again, a publication that was made in direct relation to the show, as a catalog, as a navigational tool, as a research supplement that one could take. And in this publication, there was more information about the individual works. So if you wanted a deeper reading, then you could get that through the book. And then we did a series of course, public events during the show, and which was also because in Indonesia the regular exhibition period for shows is 2 weeks. And when we heard that after a 2.5-year research project, we thought, oh, well, it's a little bit lame. Can we not extend it? So we got 1 month, but still that's very short. And so then we just packed the period of the show really full with different other things. And this photo is from a biodiversity walk, which we did in the neighborhood of the gallery, where there's a river. Jakarta has 13 rivers. And the Ciliwung River is not normalized, so it runs its course. But you can see that if you go on a biodiversity walk, it's very, very much you're in the Plasticine, perhaps. And then we did a collaboration with the zoologists about practices of conservation and taxidermy for people, as well as various great groups of school children that came in. So it was a project that was also geared towards a very broad range of public and interested in establishing as many possible conversations in that space as one could think. Yeah, and so to conclude, these are the 4 forthcoming titles in the publication series. So Reverse Hallucinations in the Archipelago deals directly with issues of colonial science and kind of plugs back into the 125,000 specimens project. The Word for World is Still Forest, takes its cue from Ursula Le Guin's novella from 1972, The Word for World is Forest. And so here we are looking at a very broad range of forest meaning in a cultural as well as industrial context. Expenditures in the Decapitated Economy looks more at issues of the Capitalocene or capitalism and surveillance politics. And then These Birds of Temptation takes ornithology as a cue for, it's more a book about gender relations than about birds, but looked at through ornithology. And so in all of these cases, we have a very broad, of course, a very broad section, a group of collaborators and contributors that are from photography to natural science across the board, and each book finds its own kind of design possibilities within a range of minimal standardization as a format of the series. And so yeah, Reverse Hallucinations and The Word for World is Forest are coming out in, I hope, June, and then these ones probably next year. And The Fantasies of the Library, which I'm really excited about, was picked up by the MIT Press. Oh, hi. For the fall this year as a standalone hardcover edition, which is going to be really beautiful. And I'm very pleased that the 2 first volumes are sold out, and so I'm really, really pleased that this book can, in that mode, continue to exist in the world. Thank you. Go sit here.
Yes. We can open it.
Thank you, Anna-Sophie, for the bountiful presentation. To start, I'll be asking some questions now, but please feel free to chime in whenever you want. This is a public discussion. To start the conversation, I would like to go back to the space of the library, also historically. Like after the spaces that were very much close to an archive of inscriptions, like in ancient Egypt, Nippur, like Sumer and Babylon, the first public library, founded by Assini Pioninis, was actually at the same time concurrently a library similar to like the modern labyrinthine space of the library, but also as a place where sculptures and of authors were exhibited, and it was a space for exhibition. But there is a point which is super interesting in there, that at that time speaking in the library was not prohibited. So what would happen, it was a space of congregation where people would like take scrolls together and like read under columns. So I would like to ask you if you could talk more about when does also the book in a way becomes a space of exhibition, and this like intervallic space that you're also talking about, which is also evident in like Aby Warburg's work when he talks about the space between the 2 images, like in the Atlas. So if you could talk about this and think about also the limits that Robert Smithson is trying to break when he's talking about like sediment and border zones.
So one thing that I immediately associate with your historical reference of the library is, of course, that in the Library of Alexandria, the Museion was the space where the scrolls were kept. And so etymologically, the library and the museum as a gallery, so the gallery of as you say, sculpture and of written knowledge of scrolls is architecturally and etymologically of one origin. So that's one association that I have. Regarding the exhibitory potential of the book, or I want to actually come back to the conversation potential of the book, which is something that I also didn't say explicitly, but of course the book series enables these kind of conversations as well. So since the series is out, I don't know how many talks in different constellations we or other contributors have been able to do on the basis, on the plateau of the books. And every time we iterate, reiterate, assemble and reassemble assemble the ideas that the publication carries or doesn't. And so in that way, that has always been from the very beginning a conscious opening or a conscious intention for this book series to enable, that it's also a conversation piece, not just a private space for reading. Regarding Smithson, there's a a different quote in the Sedimentation of the Mind where he says that the brain is a corroded rock from which ideas and ideals leak. And so here you have, in the sense of the sedimentation, you have a correlation of mind, matter, and entropy. The human brain and the rock of the earth, again, like museum and the library, as something that is intertwined or entangled, if not of the same substance. And so in that sense, I find that text very interesting in that conversation.
The strata of the earth and the strata of our minds, of thoughts.
Yes, exactly. That's why intercalations is the layering of the archive, but the interruption of the intercalation of a new strata, and then how does that change the composition? How the way in which the pieces are relayed to each other. We are consciously playing with the continuous disruption of an idea. It's not easy to read that book because it's a very simple mechanism. When I first got it from the printer, having seen it on the screen for months and months and months as scroll mechanism, and then seeing it where you do that at the beginning for one day, I thought it's a complete failure. I thought this isn't working because I couldn't even understand it. But that's that kind of mechanism of stalling, of not necessarily producing another functioning narrative, but that kind of moment of oops. Where does this go? Is the interest that we have, I think, in relation also to the Anthropocene discourse, not so much to which is the proper terminology to use, but rather that kind of moment of, well, what are we going to do with this?
This is a question that always comes to mind also when thinking about like essayistic exhibitions or like this allegory between like books and exhibitions. And then you get like, so as you were saying, you have like all of these like imbricate layers within a book. Like you flip, there's a certain depth. But then if we try to think or to posit some sort of exhibition, a website as an exhibition, or like an exhibition that you could really in a way circulate online, but then also playing with the idea of like this flat screen, this one surface of the screen, but also there is in a way that has some sort of infinite capacities to like this Quora, also this receptacle, this online receptacle, which shares the same like fever with the archive as with the library and with the museum. Did you think about this, or have you ever worked on that?
Yes, I have worked on that in a previous project and in a more recent project. So I did one project, so I'm diverting from this. I did a project in 2013, which was entitled Ex Libris, and it was a series of interventions in existing libraries based on the architecture that I would find in the respective spaces, ranging from a private library that only the owners could access themselves, to a public library and an art school, to the online repository of arc.org. So in each of these cases, I was working with the structures, and so in arc.org, it was the PDF, and so I assembled a PDF on the basis of PDFs that I found inside of the archive, and you always need a selection mechanism, so in that way it was very meta, it was very self-referential. I would select books that were about books, or that were about publishing, or that were about exhibiting, and I made another publication on the basis of this, which was an exhibition book, but you accessed it through ARC itself. So it played that loop, but then of course online you always have, it's a loop, but it always has infinite edges to the outside. Which in the case of a codex-bound publication is not the same. And the more recent iteration of this was an invitation to guest curate within a framework called Unfold by an Italian curator, independent curator, Sara Giannini, who is based in Amsterdam. And she's invited a series of 8 guest curators to come in and construct kind of an exquisite corpse type of iteration, conversation, assemblage of text material in a series of folders. So it's a really neat website based on the simple online folder, and you can put things into the folder and arrange the folders. And we did, again with Etienne, we did a project that we titled The Lesson of Zoology, and so it deals with questions of the construction of nature through the lens of zoology, but then sort of explodes and implodes itself through the material that we've arranged inside of these folders.
Perhaps we could take a question from the audience now.
Yes. It's very.
Or I could continue if no one has a question.
Thank you. I am interested in that gap that you created in the exhibit with the specimen between the actual museum specimen and the different artworks, and where the critique, you mentioned earlier that the Anthropocene is often now just a new trendy word that is, that we find often, and especially at art events and in academia. So how did you curate the space of critique, both of the Anthropocene as a concept, but also the post-colonial critique that you mentioned in that space between what was already available in terms of specimen and the different artist projects?
So first of all, that exhibition wasn't explicitly framed as an exhibition about the Anthropocene. That kind of is an undercurrent in the context, but it wasn't constructed as a show that tries to unpack what is the Anthropocene. In the post-colonial sense, in this project there's a coupling of post-colonial and post-natural in the transformation of the landscape, as well as addressing Wallace, who's now commonly framed as a naturalist, addressing the mechanisms of economic production, of financialization on the basis of collection. So he, in his persona, but then you can extrapolate that out. So he was a professional collector who collected to make money, and upon which then the biodiversity and the landscape was charted and divided up by the colonial powers as resource. So this happens at a moment in time when nature is transformed into natural resource, colonial natural resource, colonial exploitation of both minerals as well as flora and fauna, wood, different types of wood, different types of metal. All of that takes place in that period, and so we try to look at the zoological collection as also a production of industrial under support. Yeah.
Another question? Okay, I could continue. So the first edition of the volume project that Sara started, she did it in Beirut, and at that time I was participating in one of the panels. I was working at a library, responsible for the library of Ashkal Alwan, and we were partners with this project. And then I remember like there was like one of the most interesting lectures that I remember and presentations watching was Marcel Mars on public library. I don't know if you're familiar with Marcel's work. Marcel is also one of the founders of ARG. He's one of the two founders. So I am in a way thinking like I'm still in the same question, thinking about this idea of intercalations, this over layering of thoughts, but also of like the different spheres within the earth, like. And if we think about it now, like also more with technological forces, we still in some sort of way perceive the earth as this flat ground, which is in a way which is just the lithosphere, while like all of the invisible geological structures are in a way as if exiled. For instance, when we say that the earth is made like 70% of water, we're just looking at the surface of the earth. Or also when we're saying, when we're also in a way talking about virtuality today and the flattening of the screen. But at the same time, if you look at also the language of research, the idea of like understanding, undermining, the act of like mining as if for information, which is also could be used very negatively now in the idea of like data mining, but has a long history. So I'm wondering whether you could, because with the lecture with Marcel Mars, like in the end we were just talking about different modes of research, that in a way his whole project is based on now everyone is a librarian. So taking the position and also reclaiming the position of the librarian. So if you could tell us a little bit about the way that you work as a curator, like more your procedure before organizing all of these more like growing organisms together and presenting them, whether in books or in exhibitions.
I'm not a miner, but I think I'm a collector.
You're a collector.
Yeah, I think it. I think it's a form of continuous collection of bits and pieces and understanding or seeing possible connections between those things, and that's serendipitous, wonderful, open-ended in that way. I'm also a collaborator, so as a curator or in the curatorial mode, in the editorial mode, you are never just one. I think that's very important. That's very important in my work. So in that way, both a collector but also a connector. And then each time, I think in my work or in my understanding of context or the reading of materials, then there becomes a question of how are you going to articulate that in the space? Which form does it need to take? So even in the book series, it's a series we thought we're going to be so well off now with volume 3 and 4 because we have established a standardized mode of layout. But then, of course, that's not the case. Each time you have to understand what does the piece require for it to articulate in space, as well as in the sphere of ideas, and that's a really exciting, but very unpredictable process. And I think in that way, again, the practice. So I often hyphenate it as curatorial, editorial, but then it also kind of spills over into, or it takes from an artistic methodology or mode of production in the sense that it's much more than an institutional curator inviting artists to to come into a space. There's so much layering of relaying of information.
Can you expound on the choice of like coupling agencies with publishing and urgencies with exhibition?
Yeah. So what I tried to, why I kind of separated that in this way was because I tried to, in the part that I read from Fantasies of the Library, it's trying to set a mental stage, a cognitive, like a stage, a scenario for thinking, an approach to thinking or unthinking. Whereas in the exhibition part, I used your term urgencies because it deals with species extinction. It deals with urgent environmental and ecological questions that are in that project, that the project is driven through in a way where the question of political engagement is kind of more direct. Whereas the book project is a very, at the same time, is a very intellectual project, and so it's very fine in the way that it is constructed. So that one, I think, my proposition is that it creates a mode of being or not be of becoming, whereas the urgency is grappling with the worldly matter
of staying, perhaps, or preservation.
Yeah, not necessarily, but yeah, that's why I did that.
Okay.
And that's also what the position of Fantasies of the Library that it kind of tries to do in relation to the 5 remaining books, where we say this is sort of the meta book that sets the stage. It's a shelf to the following works. It kind of unhinges the habitual modes of thought in order to then be able to look at the themes or the questions in the following publications in a certain way. It's like a kind of turning a switch.
This is so wonderful. Thank you. I'm interested in the notions of mechanisms, and in the project in Indonesia, you called out structurally for us the artists that were invited from Indonesia versus the other ones, although in the announcement it just says 25, right?
Yeah.
But I am curious in terms of mechanisms of engagement with the different artists and your thesis, since all we saw were a few examples of the more European Western, would you be willing to go a little bit deeper into telling us about some of the other ways and other mechanisms that came into play from working with some of the other artists?
Right,
in
totally.
the exhibition?
Yeah, great question. Thank you so much for pointing that out. The separation there is an artificial separation, which in the space didn't occur in that way at all. No, I know. And the works that were, so there, it was a question of fund. It was in the production sense, it was a question of funding to be able to invite certain people, and that was regional collaborations. The invitation was based on proposals that we made a research dossier before the exhibition that we launched together with the call, and it contained a lot of the archival material that we had collected over the 2 years previous to the opening of the show, as a gathering of potential material that could be interesting to work with. And it was as much as a series of online platforms of digitization of the Wallace material. So all his letters are online at the London Natural History Museum and so forth. So it was like, okay, here's the stuff, and please pick out something and let us know how we can work together. And so one of the works that came out of it, so these were mostly emerging or younger Indonesian artists, and one of the works that came out of it was, I totally should have put pictures up of this, was an installation that took its cue from, on the one hand, Wallace's insect collection, so all the bugs, and on the other hand, Aprina and Barroto were really interested in the commercial mechanism of both the natural history exhibition as sort of like still a blockbuster, very popular possibility for exhibition making, as well as those histories of extraction and monetization through each individual beetle. And so what they made were a set of hobby kits. So these boxes where you can make an airplane out of plastic parts. So it's these frames with the different plastic parts in it, and then you meticulously glue it together and paint it. And so they produced with 3D printing, they produced a whole series of these beetles, bugs, disassembled, and so they displayed on it. It was a large table, so they displayed the plastic frames with the different parts still in it, as well as a whole cabinet of beetles that looked exactly like the natural beetles in the other cabinet over there. And so that wasn't clear, and then it wasn't clear, is this something that, does it already exist? Is it a unique, they made 15 boxes that were piled on the side, and then the arrangement of the bugs themselves. And it wasn't clear, is this something that is being sold? Does it exist anywhere in the shop yet? So it played with all of these different registers. And that level of ambiguity was something that worked really nicely with the concept of the show. That was great. Then we had another installation that played on the idea of evolution and survival of the fittest. It was a work by Tintin Vulia, an Indonesian artist that's based in Australia, and she made an installation of scientific apparati, glass flasks, and tripods, and put a fighting fish inside of the glass flask with mosquito larvae that the fish was eating, but at the same time they were hatching inside of the flask, and whichever mosquito was sort of evolutionary strong enough could escape into the gallery space. And all of this was recorded in time-lapse 24/7 and played back on a video monitor behind the installation so that you could see the amount of mosquitoes hatching. And then, of course, in a country where malaria and dengue fever are strong realities, then you had that mode of haunting in the space as well. So that's just two examples. Then there was a work about the colonial extinction of the tiger. So the artist this is an ongoing project of his. He collected historical photography of tiger hunts and created an arrangement of these photographs in the vitrines together with a tiger skin from the collection of zoology, as well as a tiger skull. So here the zoological and the cultural historical was blended directly in that artistic installation. Yeah, different. Then another work by Cindy Lin, who is now doing her PhD with Paul Edwards in Michigan. She's a coder and a kind of from the maker scene, and so she made these small audio instruments which were using a type of metal which is being mined in Indonesia at a place where a snail, which is named after Wallace, is going extinct because of the mining. And the little sound objects were supposed to create this, or they could, but we didn't turn it on all the time. They had this terrible siren sound, like an alarm that you couldn't bear. And so trying to work through these questions.
You know, how does that problematize or complicate, you know, these questions of the colonial, a neoliberal, you know, a lot of the problematics that you surfaced? I mean, you ultimately end up really tackling those in doing a transnational project like this. So I think that that's quite interesting to continue to think about how that all plays out. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I don't want to belabor the concept of the Anthropocene, because I know you didn't want to thematically structure your talk around that,
So
or this
go
discussion
ahead.
for that matter. But I'll go. Yeah. I was curious about the relationship that you see, the evolving relationship between the context of the Anthropocene and the Hakaveh imperative to deal with the Anthropocene and the evolution of the book series itself, and whether or not you feel like your Intercalations is kind of leaving that behind, or if you're, I guess, foreseeing exhibitions and installations and sort of curatorial projects that are going to take the Intercalation series away from the Anthropocene?
Well,
as a general context.
The series is commissioned, comes out of the 2-year cycle that the Haus der Kulturen did. They did this on the Anthropocene. So there's an expectation to be working about questions of nature culture, but not more. And the books themselves aren't continuously about the meaning of the Anthropocene as such. It's more like a field within which we find ourselves, and you don't even need to call it the Anthropocene. It's a relationship to, it's a critical relationship to our existence, where we cannot not think about the planetary impact that our actions or other actions, this question of the we and our is also problematic in that. But so it's an opportunity to work about to kind of come into contact and to operate on a really large spectrum of cultural questions, and not be hindered by disciplinary boundaries. I think that's essentially the exciting part of the book series. And then the Anthropocene terminology itself kind of retreats into the background. It's more a possibility to work with thinkers from the sciences, from arts, from everything in between, and make really unique collaborations with each other. I think that's the one thing that I personally really enjoy and what I'm grateful for in the work in this broader context of Anthropocene, whatever scholarship, is because in these events or in this context, you do have an opportunity to talk across these traditional disciplinary field schools boundaries, and look at a common thing like the forest from these angles, and not so much think about although you always have to establish what is your vocabulary, because the other person isn't going to necessarily understand your words in the same way, right? But to work on that together and to think that through together, and I think that's the productive part for me.
Epistemologically, don't you think, like, in these types of collaborations where in a way like you're breaking the boundaries between disciplines and working with people who supposedly work in different fields, do you think that this is a chance to develop perhaps a new lexicon? Or epistemologically, where do you find yourself within this? Like, you're working within the field of both art or science, or it's something that is interdisciplinary or perhaps indisciplinary, or how would you like to see it epistemologically at large?
I would say it's undisciplined,
Okay.
Promiscuously and joyfully so.
Okay.
And what it does in terms of a lexicon, I'm not sure. It's a proposition, it's an experiment, it's a search for methodology. But establishing another totalitarian lexicon is certainly not the intention.
Yeah.
As well as another big narrative is not the intention.
No.
It's a
No,
search,
yeah.
it's a putting things into vicinity and then seeing what happens, what could happen, what somebody else sees in it in conversations such as these.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't mean to create a new lexicon or another like more rigid structure. On the contrary, I was more with the interdisciplinary side, if we could call it this way, and thinking about like there's also even these limits within language that we create by within the field or discipline. If we really try to think of like one field of knowledge as if knowledges are fields or less. So yeah. Does anyone still have a question?
To sort of continue that question a little bit, because what I find remarkable in your books, and I must say that I only know the first, or the purple one, no, the animal, yeah. But what I find remarkable is how you seem to mix, let's say, different languages, not only language as text language, but also the role of the images within the context of the book, and how that sort of perhaps even bridges, let's say, the territories maybe between the different disciplines. So to me it seems that the images play a definitely totally equal role, which I also saw somehow in the exhibition that you showed. No, when you created these boxes with the undressed gorilla or the empty raincoat, so to say. You know, and how these different objects also start forming a language that is not, let's say, supported directly by a label that says what it is, but that you sort of have to figure out as a viewer that can, let's say, read into the material. That I find really interesting. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that, because that's, I think, is a curatorial position, no?
Yeah.
Or the position of a reader, perhaps, I should say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that I'm really grateful for this comment. That's how am I going to? This was so well put. I could not agree with it more. There is the image and text, and this comes out of this work. I think about out of the broader trajectory of research of how do you position the gallery space that is a visual, a performative space, to the or a curatorial space of a room or an installation, to the lexical space of a publication. And so how do you, these cognitive realities, how can you bring them together? And how are they brought together? For example, and then there's historical precedents. André Malraux, as problematic in a colonial sense as he is, but the way that the visual narrative is created through a composition of, so an art historical narrative is created through juxtaposition of images. Or in A.B. Warburg's Mnemosyne panels, the way that a narrative is proposed through visual material, the question of reproduction, a reproduction that is both visual as well as textual. You saw that maybe in the way that the pictures, I don't put them there just to have, there is a hope that the image of on the screen and whatever is being read or talked about establishes a space within which we then find ourselves. So that we are always finding ourselves in a a field of tension or of conversation already that is more than, or that we are in the middle of something. Yeah.
Maybe this is a good moment to say a few words and to wrap up the
this wonderful conversation. So thank you, Anne-Sophie, and for your wonderful interrogation of intercalation, which is for me really an artistic proposition, I would say, not only curatorial and editorial, but artistic, as it is, first of all, produces space through putting into question and disrupting something that is a convention. The sediments, is something that is also not only in geological sense, but also in a sense of what we agree, what we develop as kind of like as consensuses. So sediments of consensuses, and I think in terms of establishing what Jessica said, epistemology, or kind of like a proposition for the new terms that break through those conventions. I think that is kind of essential, artistic, and I would dare to say methodology, perhaps. And for us, it is really essential to look at these methodologies. And a couple of weeks ago, Caroline Christoph Bakirdziev introduced a thought form as kind of like as a way curatorial proposition to look at the way how we can conceive spaces. Today we have another proposition, and I think for us it is essential as we are, first of all, not only in the pressing context of discussion of the library, which has brought this term by David Ajay and his series of intervention here on campus, where he addresses university, campus, and library, the future of the library. But I think for us, what we mean by this future here at ACT is, first of all, our own kind of like, momentum that we're trying to kind of like unearth. And what I mean by that is as we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the CAVS, of the program that we are continuing here through ACT, and we are looking into archives. And first of all is all these attempts actually that started in 67, 72 through Kepesh, and his and today I see also Keiko Prince is here, one of the first fellows at CAVS. And these first attempts to engage the ecological crisis, so perhaps, today with this wonderful work that you're engaging and your collaborators are engaging, we see perhaps kind of, the second generation, right? And for us it is really important how could we understand this genealogy and see where it's actuality, So in a way, if we put back into these words of how the series is framed, where there are these agencies and urgencies of this genealogy that is not only speaking about the practice, but also about the pedagogy. And again, I would think and insist that if we look back into the first model of the museum, which is perhaps the British Museum, right? We see certainly the attempt to educate a citizen, right? And perhaps British Museum is 1700, right? If I'm not mistaken. So we see this kind of like attempt. So what are these urgencies of pedagogy today in kind of like hacking the archives as recorded the grand narratives of how the regimes of governmentality try to inscribe itself into the present but also into the future. And for us it is really the urgency perhaps is to unearth those and see where could be our agencies of today's time. So thank you for resonating with our own urgencies by bringing this wonderful presentation and methodology and practice and sharing this with us. And thank you, Jessica, for your well and mindfully and sensible prepared questions. And thank you all the audience staying with us. And last but not the least, I would like to thank also Lucas Freeman for being great collaborator within the series, and also Madeline Gallagher and everyone who are supporting us tonight behind the camera and behind the sound, mixing desk and the lights and the space and all the infrastructure. And last but not the least, I would like to invite everyone to the next events. And you see a few of those listed here. April 25, Corinne Disserance, and May 2, we end up series with Lars Banglarshan. But before that, during coming days, we have few discursive events that are framed as workshops. And the first one will take place here on April 6 with Eric Lutenberg, an open platform from Amsterdam, together with Lara Baladi, lecturer at ACT, also Alessandra Renzi, professor from Northeastern University, and also Lucas Freeman, right in residence here at ACT, the Affect Space, and the second event with John Grimond-Prez, the filmmaker from Belgium, who will screen his film Radical Ecology here in this space. And those both events take place on Wednesdays, so April 6 and April 13. And well, maybe on that note, I should thank all of you staying tonight, and thank you, Anne-Sophie and Jessica. Thank you.